Hey guys, what is up? Super K Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is time for day number 1 of the play-ins at the World Championships in 2024. This is the first day of action at Worlds this year, and man, am I excited for it. We've really been building up to Worlds for quite a while. I think the schedule this time around was just better. We haven't had as many gigantic breaks, but for these major region teams, it has been a couple of weeks since they stepped on the Rift. Of course, we've had America's Challengers to hold us over, but this has been a long-awaited start to this tournament, so I'm excited to get into covering it, reviewing it. If you are new to the channel, what of course we are going to do is go over every single game at this tournament day by day as they happen, and so if you're interested in that, hit subscribe and stick around on the channel, but I'm not going to ask you to do too much before you see any of the content. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much. Let's get right into it. First things first, if you want to check out my thoughts and opinions on what I'm expecting from not only the teams that we're going to talk about today, but of course all of the teams at the tournament, check out the power rankings, the primer video up in the iCard. That is a video that's going to go over everything you need to know about the tournament, every single team, every single player, you know, play styles, expectations, floors, ceilings, that kind of stuff. If you are interested in my thoughts heading into the tournament, that is kind of a must-watch. I highly recommend you check it out. It's over 2 hours. It's got everything you need to know, and so if you're interested at all, please check that video out. We put a lot of time and effort into that, but of course, you don't need to watch it in order to understand today. We're going to be going over everything that happened on day number 1, so that's the first 2 best of 3s in the play-in stage, the upper side of the bracket, if you will, and I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning, so let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the best of 3s, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of both series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will quickly be talking about how this affects the bracket, how this affects all of the series moving forward, but of course, most of today will be spent talking about the 2 series that we started off Worlds with. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Our first series of the World Championships in 2024 is actually home turf for one of the teams. It's of course in Berlin. It's at the LEC studio, and so kicking it off with an LEC team just seemed right. It's Mad Lions Koi, the number 3 seed from the LEC, taking on Viking Esports, the number 2 seed from the VCS. And if you saw my power rankings video, you would know that I think both of these teams are in the same tier, quote unquote, but they are at the top and the bottom of that tier for me. Both I think are good enough to be able to make it out of play-ins if everything were to go right, but both are also a little bit inconsistent in certain areas. It really leads me to believe that anything can happen in games with them. Neither of them are quite like guaranteed to be good. You know what I mean? Both of them have strengths and weaknesses, and I think good teams might be able to exploit those weaknesses. Hell, those weaknesses might even be able to be exploited by teams that are lower than them in my power rankings. They're pretty big weaknesses, pretty exploitable things, and we'll kind of get to that. For Mad Lions in particular, their strength over the course of this year has been being able to play towards the hot hand and a lot of their unpredictability. That is obviously what they're going to be known the most for. Mirwin's crazy picks on the top side, whether it's Nidalee, whether it's Smolder, whether it's Zeri, you know, Twisted Fate earlier on in the year before a lot of people in the West were picking it up. He's just been willing to pull out a lot of champions that I don't think a lot of other top laners are quite ready to answer at the moment, and that has been a bit of a problem for a lot of the teams that have been playing into Mad Lions if they're not quite ready for Mirwin. So we'll see if that ends up being something in this series, but their biggest strength is playing through bot lane, in my opinion. Supa and Alvaro have been very good over the course of this year, not super consistent. They're going to have some bad games every once in a while. They're young players, and they're very aggressive, and so sometimes they get themselves into danger, but I would argue they've been the strongest part of this team in terms of a consistency standpoint. Elyoya, obviously a player you have to watch out for. Frescowy, while he hasn't quite been as dominant, you know, 1v1, he's a player that a lot of people are talking up, expecting to have a nice bounce back here at Worlds. I'm not entirely sold on that just yet, but still a player that I like at least a little bit, and Mad as a unit has definitely been better than a team like Viking over the course of this year. When you're a major region team going up against the number 2 seed from the VCS, that should be a matchup that you should be able to win relatively cleanly. However, I think Viking is a little bit better than people are giving them credit for right now. Specifically, I'm really high on this bot lane. I think Shogun and BA are really good as players. I think that they have been able to dominate 2v2s in the VCS domestically, and honestly, they've looked really good being primary carries in game. I think Shogun in particular is somebody that you just have to watch out for game over game. If you let him get out of control, and if Viking actually has the better bot lane in this series, that actually is a problem for Mad Lions. I actually think that's going to be your matchup of the series, is of course Supa taking on Shogun. I think whichever one of those two ends up coming out on top and ends up looking better in this series, their team is likely going to win, because I think both of their teams rely a lot on their ability to do well in the early and in the mid game. So we'll see how that ends up going, but also I am a pretty big fan of Guri. I wasn't expecting to be so excited by his tape, but I thought it actually was really good, and so interested to see that. Kati obviously has a lot of Worlds experience, even if he wasn't super integral to this team in the summer split. Nanawe is a bit of a concern, but so is Mirwin, and honestly, either player could take advantage of the other, and I'm not going to be entirely surprised. It's a fun matchup on paper. I think both teams are actually in similar form and in similar spots in terms of their playstyle, so I'm glad to see this happen to kick off Worlds. But who's going to be able to get that debut win? Who's going to be able to walk away with the first win of the World Championships? Well, game number 1 is right now, so let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Mad Lions Koi. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to take the first game of this series and go up 1-0. Remember, this is a best of 3, and so winning game number 1 is actually super crucial. It means you only have to win one of the last 2 games. You basically put the enemy team on perfection point, if you will. They can't lose another game the rest of this series, and so Mad getting out to this 1-0 lead I think is really good. And I think the way that Matt did it was also pretty impressive. This game was a lot closer than maybe the stats on screen would indicate. You can kind of see that in the gold difference, still only about 4K by the end of this game. It went about 36-ish minutes, and, you know, the kills don't look all that close. You can see that a lot of the objectives ended up going in favor of Viking, and that's kind of where they got a lot of their resources. But this was a game where Mad Lions felt like they could lose at any moment. It really came down to the last couple of fights of this game where they just outplayed Viking. A couple of players on VKE ended up making some pretty critical errors that I will talk about, and that really ended up crashing their game down. But that wasn't to say that Mad was perfect either. They just had the best players on the Rift, and that's really what matters in a series like this where both teams are having a lot of ups and downs. It's just making sure that whoever the best player is on the Rift, or whoever the best couple players on the Rift, they're on your team. That's the important part, and that's exactly what happened for Mad, at least in this game number 1. They had a very clear game plan: get the Jinx ahead. Supa is going to get player of the game for me. Jinx was by far the most relevant champion in this game, whether you want to give a lot of the credit to Elyoya for getting, you know, really far ahead on the Nidalee in the early game. He absolutely did. This is probably his best Nidalee game I've ever seen him play. He's not actually been all that great on this champion over the course of his LEC tenure, but this was a really good showing for him. Or whether you want to give a lot of credit to Alvaro, which definitely we will talk about in just a second. I think both of those are relatively fair, but for me, the Jinx was the centralizing force through a lot of this game. The moment that she got online, the moment that she started getting items and getting resources, that's when the game became so much harder to win if you are Viking. Supa is a good enough player to be able to completely run your game plan through at this level, and again, he went out and proved that in this one. I continue to be a pretty big Supa defender. Supa and Alvaro, I think, have been a very strong 2v2, and like I said in the preview, Supa needs to step up in a series like this. Shogun is kind of the carry for Viking. He is the star right now for Viking Esports. If they were going to win, it's going to be through Shogun in the bot lane, so Supa kind of stepping up to the plate, picking a hyper carry down in the bot lane in Jinx, who I think is probably the best hyper carry in the game right now, and actively kind of fulfilling that role, being strong in the mid game and, you know, gathering resources slowly but surely and ending up in a good spot. That's exactly what you would have wanted to see out of him in game number 1, in his Worlds debut. And so very good game number 1 from Supa. Alvaro and Elyoya were obviously the big, like, helpers, the facilitators, if you will, of getting that Jinx online. Alvaro continues to look so good on these engagers. He is just a player that I don't understand why people aren't talking about more. Supa, I understand, because he was super cocky in interviews, and generally speaking, the moment that you step up and start vouching for yourself, people are either going to love you or hate you. Unfortunately for Supa, it ended up on the latter, but I don't really understand why Alvaro has kind of been lumped in there with him. Alvaro is awesome as a player. He continues to be one of the best supports that Europe has, like, end of story. He has been really consistent over the course of this year, and this meta fits him really well because he is a very good engage player. So the bot lane really stepping up for Mad. Elyoya, like I said, also probably his best game on Nidalee. His early game was spectacular. Playing Nidalee in a Lee Sin can sometimes actually be a little bit difficult because Lee actually has so much prio and pressure through Orianna and through Camille. A lot of these more aggressive avenues that Viking has that Mad just doesn't have. Like Syndra can't really match the kind of pressure that Lee Sin plus Orianna is going to be able to create in mid-game skirmishes. The Cassante certainly is not going to be able to match the pressure of Camille, especially when it's Mirwin piloting that Cassante. And so Nidalee's job is not free in this game. It's not the easiest Nidalee game of all time, but it still was very good here, and the B1 ended up working out well. You had the Syndra here in the mid lane. It was generally fine. I think this could have been punished more if Kati had existed in this game really at all, but he didn't. Frescowy basically had a free game, and that's fine. Syndra continues to be a pick that I think will lower in priority as we go on throughout the tournament. Just haven't really seen anything to convince me that she is more broken than any of the other mages in the game right now that just offer significantly more utility. Her value, in my opinion, is as a blind pick because I think she's very flexible. I think she can be dragged and drafted into basically any team comp, and so if you want to like B1, B2, blind pick a Syndra, I think that's generally going to be where her biggest use case is, but as a B5, like counter pick to Orianna, I'm just not a huge fan, and in this game it kind of worked out, but it also just wasn't all that relevant. And then you have Mirwin in the top lane. He tried his best to lose this one for Mad. This was not a good game from him, and that is not rare. His Cassante is horrible. It's always been horrible. It's been bad throughout the entire year. It's a big reason why I'm concerned about him as a player, because honestly, he's not been very good at the meta top laners over the course of this year. He's really only been good at his weird counter picks, and so if he's forced to play things like Cassante throughout a lot of the rest of this tournament, I think he is going to struggle, but at least in this game, it wasn't enough to derail what was a really strong hyper carry, and so for Mad, well done playing towards your win con, and then for Viking on the other side, this was just one of those games where it felt like you should have been a lot closer than you actually were. You had a Camille that was genuinely very fed, even if Nanaue was making a ton of mistakes down the stretch. You had an Ezreal who was relatively in a good position, not quite in as good of a position as the Jinx on the other side of this matchup, but Ezreal was still able to deal a lot of damage. You have so many tools in the early game here. You have a Camille that should be winning. You have an Orianna that's going to have more prio. You have a Poppy that shuts down a lot of what like Nautilus or Nidalee, like a lot of those combos that shuts down a lot of what they want to do. And you have a Lee Sin. Like, you have so many proactive tools to be able to get yourself into good spots in this game, and it just didn't feel like they did that. It felt like they kind of got brain and hands gapped. They got brain gapped at the beginning of the game, and they certainly got hands gapped at the end. Kati is going to get dud of the game. This is one of the worst Orianna performances I've seen, not only because he just wasn't playing well, but because he wasn't playing, like, at all. He was playing so scared. It didn't feel like he was comfortable on the stage. I don't really know what the reason for this is. He's maybe the most experienced member of Viking Esports in terms of, playing on these big stages, and so for him to feel like he's getting stage fright in game number one, that's really not ideal. This just wasn't a very active or good Orianna game, and he really let his team down in that regard, but you can kind of point to a lot of different areas. Nanaue, kind of doing his thing where he just gets caught out randomly in the late game and gives over his entire lead. He is not a player that I feel particularly good about going into this tournament. As I said in my primer, he got the lowest grade of any player at the entire tournament from me coming out from watching his tape. This guy is a liability to Viking, and even with a lead in this game, he wasn't particularly relevant. Shogun and BA just weren't perfect down the stretch. I think Guri could have done more. Overall, Viking just felt outclassed, and that was by a Mad Lions team that was also making mistakes. Not a great debut, but if you can turn it around in game number 2, if you can tie up the series, then it's winner take all in a game number 3. You just have to win 2 games against Mad. With the way that they're playing, I don't think that that is entirely impossible, but they need to be able to turn around whatever their form was here in game number 1. For Mad, just keep the pressure on. If you've got to play through Supa, who's the hot hand, or Elyoya, or Alvaro, or whoever you feel like the hot hand is right now, then just do that. Like, you don't have to overcomplicate the situation. Just play to whatever you feel like is working at the moment. So, is Mad going to be able to get that 2-0 clean sweep and, move their way on to the finals of this upper side already, or is Viking going to be able to tie up the series and bring our first series to a game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Mad Lions. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series 2-0, and they will be moving on to the upper bracket finals here of the upper side of the bracket. That feels like a very weird way to end up saying that, but they go to winners finals of their side. You guys know what the format looks like. You don't need me to explain it to you. If you do, I'll do it at the end of the video. But Mad Lions looked really good in this game number 2. I think this was a much cleaner game than game number 1. You didn't leave nearly as many options open, and this was a sensational performance performance once again from the bot lane. It just continues to be a bot gap here, and for Shogun and BA, who were the strength of Viking, like, that's not a good sign. And we'll talk about Viking. There are reasons to be concerned that this team is not nearly as good as I expected them to be going into this tournament, but Supa and Alvaro, oh my god, what a Worlds debut from them. This makes my channel look like $1 million because I've been dying on the hill of these two players over the course of this year. I've received so much backlash for being so high on them and calling them at times a top 2, top 3 bot lane in the LEC. They played like it in this series. They certainly did. Now, they weren't the only players to play well. You run back the Nidalee plus the Syndra. Hell, you even run back the K'Sante. Basically, this entire comp is the same as game number 1 with the exception of going for something a little bit different in the support position, but this was just a great performance overall from Mad. They were winning across the board, and bot lane was just kind of the encapsulation of that. But player of the game and player of the series to me is going to go to Alvaro in the support position here on the Rel. This just was an insane series from Alvaro. He continues to look awesome. The hooks on Nautilus in game number 1 were really setting up basically everything for Mad Lions in terms of the plays that they wanted to make. And on the Rel in game 2, like, this is genuinely one of the best games that Alvaro has played in quite a while. And he's already been one of the best supports in the LEC. This just was so dominant. He looked like he was so much better than all of the players on the side of Viking, whether it was catching out the Jarvan over and over again or the Orianna, who was basically a ward throughout this entire game. Alvaro was so useful in setting up every single play that Mad Lions wanted to make and capitalizing on all of the mistakes that Viking was making on the other side of this as well. But you don't want to discredit Supa. I mean, 13, 2, and 7 on the Jinx is certainly not something to scoff at. This guy barely missed out on his penta a couple of times. I saw someone on Reddit say that he's edging his penta. Very funny. But Supa was great in this series. As a primary carry, if you need him to just sit there and play Jinx or any of these other hyper carries, I think that's actually probably the most consistent way for Mad Lions to win games, is to play towards Supa as their primary win condition. And so really happy to see them kind of go to that, and really happy to see Supa step up. I think he's going to continue to be a monster over the course of this play-in tournament, and especially with what we'll talk about later on in the day. Supa and Alvaro are certainly not in a position where they can't just, like, run the play-ins and come out of this next series dominating and, you know, move on to the main stage 4-0. Like, I think that's very reasonable if these two continue at the pace that they are on. Elyoya was also excellent. 2 games of Nidalee. In both games, he was able to generate gigantic leads in the early game. Now, the late games are a little bit more sloppy, and that's just generally what you would expect from, like, a Nidalee plus I guess Nidalee comp. Like, honestly, there's nothing else on this team that would necessarily indicate that they would be bad in the later half, but mostly that's what you would expect from LEC teams. That's just generally kind of been the scouting report on them the past couple of years, is that their late games are just really bad. They're not very clean at closing out games. Elyoya is part of that problem, but Nidalee, I think, as a champion, just generally struggles with that. I think Fresskowy being a bit stronger in this game definitely helped, but I think he's going to need to be even better in the upcoming games if they want to be able to be a bit more clean, a bit more consistent. I think Jungle and Bot are doing their job, but, you know, Fresskowy, I think, was fine in this series. Certainly better than Kati, who was a disaster on the other side, but, I mean, that was basically a given. If Kati was going to play the way that he did, all Fresskowy had to do was not be horrible, and that's kind of what he achieved. Mirwin still concerns me. He's just not very good at K'Sante. Like, that just continues to be an issue for him. I do not understand why this team continues to prioritize that champion. Maybe they just don't think it matters, but I would much rather him just go for almost anything else. Even if there's any, like, pseudo relevant top laner in the meta right now that he feels more comfortable on, just pick that instead. I don't even care if it's blind pick Camille or Jax or whatever at this point. Like, he's just not good at K'Sante, and I think you can get away with it at this level. You're not going to be able to get away with it for much longer, and especially even in the next series, it's probably not going to be something that you can survive on if he's going to struggle. But everybody else on this team did their job, and everybody else was good, specifically the bot lane, who I think were stars in this series. But for Viking, on the other side, a lot of negatives, a lot of things to be worried about. The 0-2 was obviously not an ideal scoreline, but if it happened and they looked okay, I would feel all right about them, because this is kind of expected. Mad Lions should be the better of these two teams, but they made so many individual mistakes. It wasn't even Mad that played, like, phenomenal, although Supa and Alvaro did a lot of really good things. Elyoya did a lot of really good things, but so many mistakes by Viking where they just were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or they're just actively not outputting as much damage as they need to, or just generally losing in a lane matchup that they have no business losing in. It just didn't feel like they were locked in, and I don't know if it's stage nerves. I don't know if they just don't have a very good, you know, read on the current patch, or if they don't feel comfortable. Like, I don't know what it is, but this was a disaster for them. Orianna and Jarvan should be a relatively easy to execute combo, and it felt impossible for them to find any sort of actual setup throughout this entire game. Guri is going to get dud of the game. I was hyping him up a lot in my primer coming into this tournament. Boy, did he not deliver in series number 1. Hopefully he can bounce back, but I already talked about it a bit when it came to Alvaro. Just walking around in the jungle and getting caught out over and over again. Didn't really feel like he had a purpose for a lot of this game, and this is kind of the problem with Jarvan, is I think Jarvan functions in a very specific way, and everybody's always so keen to play Orianna plus Jarvan. Everybody's so keen to pick up this combo, but the problem with Jarvan as a champion is that when he has to play from behind, he is like giga useless. He genuinely cannot play the game. He's like Vi, but even worse in that regard. And so, you know, Jarvan's fine. Like, again, I've heard so much talk about how he's going to break the meta. I think good teams will make him look good, and teams that can't win early are going to make him look literally unplayable, and that's kind of what we saw here. Also, Kati, what is happening? Orianna should just be the better version of Syndra right now. She just does a little bit more in terms of utility. Even if they both do a lot of damage, she might not be quite as safe, but she's pretty darn close, and she does set up for a lot of other plays, and Kati felt like he just did not understand what he was supposed to be doing. Again, I don't really know what's going on. Kati did concern me a bit in terms of his tape coming out of the VCS, but I chalked it up to just like small sample size, especially with how well Guri, Shogun, and BA were playing, but Kati has not looked good at all in the first 2 games. That's got to turn around. Nanaue is going to be a liability for this team. Shogun and BA already lost to Supa and Alvaro, which is not really ideal. Viking, just a lot of the things I was really excited about when it came to this team, they did not come to fruition in this first series. They're going to have another shot, but they've only got one more life. They've got to use it carefully, but for Mad, like I said, moving on to take on the winner of the series we're going to talk about next, and whoever they end up playing, they're going to be considered, maybe not favorites, like, depending, obviously, but certainly contenders to be able to make it out of this side of the group as the best team on this side of the group. Obviously, the only major region team on this side, but they looked great in this first series. If Supa and Alvaro can step up, and if Elyoya can continue to be a big nuisance in the early game, I don't really see a lot of teams being able to shut them down at this level. But then moving on now to our second series of the day, and this one is just as interesting on paper. I think that I definitely thought this was going to be a little bit more of a blowout, but, you know, we'll see how it ends up going. It's, of course, the number 1 seed from the PCS in PSG Talon, taking on the number 1 seed from the CB LOL in Pain Gaming. There are a lot of storylines going into this. PCS versus CB LOL is obviously already a very interesting matchup. Stylistically, the PCS kind of known for being a bit of a slower region in terms of their style, probably the slowest of the regions in terms of being more macro-oriented, less skirmish-oriented. That's kind of been PSG's MO over the past couple of, you know, years, really, at this point, that we've seen them internationally. And for Pain and for the CB LOL on the other side, obviously the first thing you think of when you think of CB LOL representatives at Worlds are crazy fights, lots of action, no brain, all hands, like that kind of style. And I do think that makes for a very interesting matchup here in round number 1, but typically speaking, the brains part of that duo ends up coming out on top. When you talk about historical matchups, teams that are a little bit more mechanic focused can just be stretched apart very easily by teams that have a very good understanding of where they want to be on the map. And I value PSG very highly. You would know that if you watched my power rankings video. Not only did I rank them as the number 1 team in the play-in stage, I had them as a tier above every other team in the play-in stage. I genuinely do think that they are just better right now than a lot of those other teams. They already took down FlyQuest in the spring split at MSI, and I think they're better in summer. I think they've gotten more complete. I think the bot lane has really stepped up. Woody has been like a pseudo superstar in the support position. That's alongside Junjia and Maple looking really good. Aji has been very aggressive. The guy was like leading all first blood percentage for like basically everybody in the PCS, and as a top laner, that's ridiculous. And like obviously you have a lot of talent on this team too. It's not just brain, but they have a very good idea of how they want to play the game, where they want to put their resources, and it's really allowed them to be hyper consistent in a pretty good league in the PCS. But for Pain on the other side, it's kind of the opposite. Not only did they come into my lowest tier, they came in as my lowest team at this tournament. I just was not impressed with the tape that I ended up seeing from them. I think they come in with a lot of genuine concerns about whether or not they're going to be able to translate their style from what they were domestically to what they are internationally. They rely a lot on their hands. Like, they're not particularly impressive in terms of the plays that they're making. They're really bad at closing out games. They just had such overwhelming leads in a lot of circumstances that they were able to get away with it. But honestly, there is a lot not to like about the Pain Gaming tape. Now, what is there to like? Well, I think that they're very balanced in terms of how they want to play. They don't really rely on one player or two players to be able to carry carry them across the line like you're going to see from a lot of teams around their level. They kind of can go anywhere with a lot of their resources. They can play the hot hand, which I think is a very valuable thing in League of Legends right now, because basically any lane can carry if you give them enough setup. I do think they have like preferences. They want to play towards Titan. He is definitely kind of the primary carry for this team, but they can play for Dinketo. They can play for Weiser in the top lane. They can even play for Karaoke in the jungle. Like, they have multiple different options to be able to play through that kind of make their team a little bit difficult to scout for outside of draft. Like, once you see their draft, you know where they're going to go with a lot of their resources, but before game, you don't have a great idea. They can kind of go a bit of everywhere, so that's definitely an advantage, but at the same time, I don't think they have like a star on their team. They don't really have a player that I think could just be good enough to carry them across teams that are probably a bit better than they would normally be able to beat. Typically speaking, that's when you get a lot of these big upsets, is when you have, you know, at least one player that can step up and can compete with a lot of the other players that they're playing against, and I'm just not sure Pain has that right now. And so when you look at this matchup, I'm very concerned for Pain. I think this should theoretically be a blowout, but you never know what's going to happen. I mean, Pain is a very aggressive team. If they just, you know, blow the doors off of PSG in game number 1 and, you know, by 15 minutes have this gigantic lead and then end up closing that game out, all of a sudden this series becomes a lot more interesting. But the longer these games go, the more I would expect PSG to just be able to tear Pain Gaming apart. So, is that what's going to happen, or is Pain actually going to overperform my expectations? Perhaps PSG could underperform my expectations. We will see right now, because the winner of game number 1 was Pain Gaming. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and this is not how I expected this series to start. This is basically the exact opposite of what I just spent the last 5 minutes talking about. Throw all that analysis out the door, because Pain Gaming just played a very slow, very methodical, very calculated game and just completely out-macroed PSG. I don't know what the hell happened in this game. PSG looked like the worst team I've ever seen. Like, this has to be some sort of outlier. I don't imagine this is replicable by PSG. You know, we'll talk about it. The broadcast had a very interesting narrative for this that I'm going to definitely try my best to not just dispel, but like try to put into you guys' heads that it's a lot more dynamic than I think a lot of people are going to make it out to be right now in terms of drafts and in terms of patch notes and meta and all that stuff. We'll definitely talk about it, but the difference in this game was not the champions. Like, you can't just look at this game and be like, it was clearly the Rumble's fault. He only did 25,000 damage, second most in the entire game. Oh, it was clearly the Tristana's fault, who just wasn't involved in a lot of the plays. Like, it wasn't that she lacked damage, it's that she wasn't there for a lot of them. Like, the problems for PSG were entirely execution. You could absolutely win the game with this draft right now. Even if I don't think it's exactly the strongest thing in the world to draft, I don't think it's moronic, as the broadcast would make it out to be, that PSG drafted this. I don't think they lost in draft. I think that that is just honestly a not real take. Like, I get it. Like, I understand that there's a narrative that they want to push, and generally speaking, this is just how it ends up going, but I think it's a really binary way of looking at a situation that's just not binary. If you were watching this game and the difference to you isn't execution, I don't know what to tell you. This was awful from PSG. I could have played this game better than a lot of PSG players, and that's not a good thing. So we'll get into it, but let's talk about the positives for Pain first. First of all, player of the game should go to everyone. This was a team effort from Pain. There was not one player that was just kind of dominating, and this has kind of been the trend, I would say, for Pain over the course of this year, is when they win, it's oftentimes kind of spread out amongst a lot of the players. There's not one star, and I think that continued here, but if I had to pick one, it's gonna be Curry in the support position. He was awesome here on the Nami. Nami was a problem for PSG. They didn't really have an answer to this. It completely disrupted everything that the Misfortune wanted to do, because she absolutely could not sit there and, you know, press R. Like, that's a bit of a problem for the MF, who was the only one with any sort of gold going into the later half of this game. All of a sudden, the Nami is just going to be able to shut her down in a lot of these fights, and obviously the tidal waves are big. Being able to enable Lucian to do the most damage in the game, that's pretty big, and Titan obviously was great as well. We will talk about him in a second, but it really was Curry in the support position that I think was kind of the star for me and the standout, and I think the most important player in this game. But if you wanted to give it to Titan because he just absolutely blew up the damage charts, I think that's totally fine as well. The Lucian was excellent. His positioning was very good. He was willing to play really safe in the early game, which typically speaking you don't see out of a lot of Lucian players, especially, you know, like Brazilian Lucian players. I expected him to want to skirmish a lot in this matchup. I figured that was why they wanted to opt into something like this, but no, he actually played it really sane, really slow, and he understood that MF actually has priority early on here. The moment that he hits 2 items, he's willing to go all in and play like an assassin, and that's exactly what you want to see. This was a perfectly executed Lucian game from Titan. I think Weiser was also great on the top side. I've not really been hyper impressed by him. I didn't think he was like a star or anything for this team. You know, top lane in general, I think is pretty weak at this tournament, but he was really good in this game on the Jax. People are going to point to the Rumble, but again, the Rumble did a lot of damage in this game. It wasn't like this champion was entirely useless. It just was that Jax was more relevant, and I think Rumble is significantly more beatable now. Rumble is much more punishable in the early game. He's losing a lot of damage in his trades, and I think that that definitely makes picks like Jax a little bit more valuable because they can scale much more effortlessly now. They're not put in such horrible positions just from being into Rumble, and I think that's kind of the nerf. Rumble can still do a lot in the late game. He's still a team fighting monster, but Jax was just a little bit more valuable in this game. And then, of course, the dynamic duo of Sejuani Yone that I think is kind of like the Exodia of this current patch. I do think that these are the two most valuable champions because of how they pair with each other. Yone, probably the best champ in the game. Sejuani, the best champion for getting the most out of Yone, in my opinion, and so I'm not shocked to see them get a win in their first duo game together. But Pain in general, just a very clean, very calculated game, and it's not really what I expected, but I'm certainly excited to see it. And then for PSG on the other side, there are so many negatives to give in terms of how this team ended up playing this game. So many mental errors, and it's got to start, and honestly, it kind of ends with Junjia. Like, holy crap, this might be the worst jungle performance I've ever seen. If you want to blame Rumble and Tristana and those draft picks for even misfortune, right, for being out of meta and, you know, for being nerfed on the past couple of patches, they're not good enough to be played at Worlds, you can go ahead and do that. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to look at Junjia, who's picking Skarner, one of the more playable jungle champions in the game right now, and is just walking up and dying every single fight, doing literally nothing. He was worse than a ward. Like, this is just one of the genuinely most terrible jungle performances I've ever seen, and that's so frustrating coming out of Junjia, who's supposed to be one of the best junglers in the play-in stage. This is a guy that I've put a lot of stock and faith in over like the last 3 years. This is a guy who almost qualified for Worlds with Edward Gaming in the LPL a couple of years ago. They did qualify for Worlds. They just benched him for the playoff run, even though he got them there. And he's been able to qualify for Worlds and MSIs and things like that in the PCS ever since. This guy is phenomenally good, but I don't know what the hell happened in this game. Genuinely maybe the worst he has ever played in his entire life. And for that to be in game number 1 here, just not a very good look. I genuinely cannot stress how bad this game was from Junjia. Again, if you want to blame the Rumble or the Tristana or the Misfortune, whatever, like, you go do your thing. I'm gonna blame Junjia because there's just simply no way I can watch this tape and not see somebody who is literally throwing the game away. Now, the Tristana didn't really have any impact on this game. You can argue that that was a bit of a Maple problem rather than a Tristana problem, but the problem for Maple this game is that he just wasn't a part of a lot of the fights that actually mattered. Aji was a part of those fights, wasn't doing nearly enough in the early game, and ended up getting outscaled by the Jax. That's the problem with Rumble now. Misfortune was fine, just couldn't actually stand there and do damage because of the Nami, and that was a bit of a problem, and Woody definitely contributing to the Rel Death Fund. Thank God I actually kept that around before the end of plans. It was looking pretty bad after the first series, but we're finally getting some donations, so PSG just have to be better. Like, this is a complete team gap. This was horrible execution from PSG. They could draft this exact same comp and obliterate the next game. Like, I absolutely believe that they could do that. I just don't think they will. I think there's some sort of mental thing going on with them right now. They've got to just change this up. Whatever you need to do to get back on page and get Junjia activated and get, you know, Woody out on the map and actually playing the game, like, just do that. I don't care what champions it ends up being. Just get them in a good spot where they're mentally actually locked in. But for Pain, you're one game away from moving on to winners finals on your side of the bracket. That would be gigantic if you took down PSG, what a lot of people consider to be the best team in this stage of the tournament, in a clean sweep nonetheless. And so, big game number 2 here, but only one team can take it. Who will it be? Well, the winner of game number 2 was PSG. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up this series at 1 apiece and keep themselves alive here. This was a much better game than game number 1. This was just kind of a destruction. This was them definitely saying, well, game 1, we were horrible and we were not locked in and we gave Pain some false hope. Let's take all of that hope away because this was easily the most dominant game of the entire day. Just a phenomenal showing from them. I think they have a very good read on what is good right now in the meta and how to punish certain things. I'm not sure this is the exact like draft I would draft some of the things they picked into, if that makes sense. Like, I think this draft generally is very good against a lot of the really highly prioritized champions. Like, if there was a Syndra or an Orianna on the other side of this matchup, I would love this draft because all of a sudden, like, the priority for things like Akali and even Gnar go up like so much, and it still is very easy to execute in the early game, but this is still a very easy to execute comp, and this is where I think you start getting the punishes for some of the things that got nerfed, because the big thing with Rumble that I've talked about is that his early game is just significantly worse. He's still Rumble in the late game. He's still going to be doing a lot of damage in team fights, and he still can be a major asset there, but he's not quite as easy to get there with as he was, a little bit ago. He's still valuable, but not quite the blind pick champion that I think a lot of people are prioritizing him as. Gnar is a perfect counter to something like Rumble because it does just take away his ability to play in the early game, and it opens up this opportunity for Gnar to just be more relevant as the game goes on. So credit to PSG. I think obviously the big pick that's going to blow people away is the Akali, and Maple is going to get player of the game here in game 2. For it, this is kind of the centralizing pick for this entire comp, but Maple had to execute on this. This isn't the easiest matchup in the world. Akali versus Yone is not one of those insta wins for Akali. There are so many things that could go wrong. This is a skill matchup, at least for the most part, and so Maple just completely outplaying Dinkato, who is on one of the strongest champions, if not the strongest champion in the game. Very good sign. Maple was really bad in game number 1 on the Tristana, just was late to every single play, was actively not really doing anything when he was there. Like, this was a much needed kind of bounce back performance from him on the Akali. And again, this champ is going to continue to have priority, I think, throughout a lot of this tournament. I was honestly considering putting not only Akali, but other assassins on my meta report video. I just wasn't certain that they were going to get a lot of play. I mentioned them in the video, but I think especially if the meta does transition more into mages, like Syndra and Orianna becoming really high priority, or even things like Twisted Fate coming in, like having something that can blow them up super easily and actively take away a lot of their mid-game tempo because you're just more valuable in that stage of the game, that could be very, very important as we go further along. And people who are good at Akali, I think, might actually have an inside track on being very relevant on this patch. We'll see how that ends up transitioning. Typically speaking, when there are a lot of immobile control mages that end up coming into the meta, then all of a sudden Akali and, a lot of LeBlanc, a lot of those other champions end up sneaking their way back in. And so we'll see if that ends up happening, but at least here, Maple looked very good. I think Junjia also had a much needed turnaround. I don't know what happened in game number 1. Genuinely, maybe the worst game I've ever seen him play. Was literally just walking up to die every single time he was alive, and was dying first in every single fight, even around objectives. He would just literally walk in and die. Don't know what happened in game 1, but game 2, way better. This was an actually good Skarner performance. Completely outjungled Vi at the beginning part of this game, and as we know, when Vi doesn't have resources, going into the back half, she is basically just going in to die in every single engage. So Junjia, Maple, the middle of the map, the part that should be the strength of PSG, actually coming through with that in game number 2. Aji was also really good in this game on the Gnar. A couple of really important engages down the stretch here. Weiser was not good on the Rumble. I think he misplayed a lot of these late game fights, just not really understanding that Rumble is a bit of a different champion now than maybe he was a couple of patches ago. Again, I think Rumble is playable. As we saw in America's Challengers, he can still be very relevant, but you do have to play him differently, and it just doesn't feel like people kind of understand that yet. And so we'll see if that ends up continuing to be a problem for players. Betty and Woody, who I was really excited about going into this tournament, they were good here. The Jhin was fine, the Rel was fine, but they were not the strength of the team. It was the middle of the map, and that's kind of what you want to see from PSG. For Pain on the other side, just not good from the top side of the map, and this is not entirely surprising. This is more of the experience that I think we were expecting going into this series. Karioke is going to get my dud of the game. The Vi was just entirely useless. Like, you cannot show me a part of this game where the Vi was relevant, got completely outjungled early on. Junjia was able to generate pressure really quickly in this game, and the moment that Karioke got behind, like, it's just over. Like, the Vi can't do anything in this game. Was, again, essentially just a champion that pressed R on somebody in a team fight and then immediately died. And for Vi, that's just not a particularly valuable role. Vi and Jarvan are very similar in that sense, where items matter so much to their integral, like, survivability in their kit that when they don't have them, when they're behind in resources, when the enemy team has more gold and more items, you're just not very useful. You're kind of useless as a champion. So we'll see if Vi continues to be highly prioritized. We saw it banned a lot throughout day number 1. Of course, the Rumble, we already talked about it. Weiser was just not very good in this game. The Gnar was way more relevant. Again, I think Rumble could theoretically still be valuable at this World Championships, but I don't think nearly as much as a blind pick, and I certainly do not think in the way that Weiser ended up playing it, just trying to be some sort of lane bully. That doesn't exist anymore. You have to play it as some sort of scaling top laner that it literally exists to take over team fights. Like, that is Rumble's entire purpose now, and so, we'll see if people transition into that. I think he's pretty similar in power level to something like Kennen over the course of, like, the last couple of months, where Kennen's been kind of a niche pick that you can pull out if you really want to play for those late game fights, and can kind of abuse some matchups in a counter pick, but for the most part, it's just saved to being, like, the 5th or 6th most played top laner. I think that's where Rumble is probably going to lie. I also think it's weird that Yone is just so inactive. Like, this is Dinkato's fault, but this is also Karioke's fault, because you just have to get this Yone involved. This is the best champ in the game, and Maple was way more active on the map. It felt like they weren't really playing around mid lane in the way that I personally would have wanted them to. Titan, Curry, they weren't exactly nearly as good as they were in game number 1. Obviously, a much smaller role here on Ezreal and Braum, but generally PSG just obliterated them everywhere across the map. This was a mega gap everywhere, and so if PSG is able to perform this again in game 3, we're all going to forget about game number 1 and we're going to chalk it up to just natural variance. But if Pain can actually win that game number 3 and prove that they deserve to be in this conversation, that completely changes the power rankings and that completely changes the perception of what the rest of this play-in stage is going to look like. So, very important game number 3. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was PSG Talon. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take this series 2-1, and they will be moving on to take on Mad Lions, with the winner, of course, qualifying for the Swiss stage of the World Championships. This is the result we all expected. We just took quite a big detour in order to get there. Game 1, obviously not ideal for PSG, but even game 3 here, like, Pain Gaming was in this game a lot longer than they probably should have been. Pain actually did a very good job of sticking around and staying relevant in a lot of these fights, but some horrible, horrible team fighting down the stretch just ends up letting them down. There were 2 fights, not 1, but 2 fights in this game that were very winnable for Pain that they threw away just by getting completely outplayed, basically a complete hands diff by PSG. The second one was hands and brain. Don't worry, we're going to get to both, but Pain very much had an opportunity to potentially win this series. They just couldn't quite capitalize on it. For PSG, on the other side of this matchup, this was a good game number 3. I think you're still looking for this team to be a bit more dominant. You probably wanted them to walk out of this series being like, yeah, we took care of business. It was easy. We're going to waltz our way into the Swiss stage, and we're actually going to be able to compete with teams like Fnatic, with teams like FlyQuest, with teams like Team Liquid. I think that's kind of the expectation for a team like PSG Talon, but that's not exactly the feeling and the vibe that we have coming off of this series. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game and player of the series kind of has to go to Maple in the mid lane, regardless of the fact that he wasn't very good in game number 1. Nobody on PSG was particularly good in game number 1, maybe with the exception of Betty, who just wasn't the problem, but Betty certainly wasn't the carry in either of the last 2 games. When you look at the wins here for PSG, they're off the back of the Akali. They're off the back of the pressure that champion was able to generate. And I think this comp is very, very smart. I think it's very easy to execute. Wukong, not a champion that has found a ton of success over the course of this year. When it is played, it's not been particularly good, but I think it's still a very easy to execute, very straightforward type of champion that you put it in the right situation and it's going to be able to do a lot of work for you. It's still very good in a lot of team fights, and Junjia was very valuable in the later team fights, as we'll talk about a bit later. You've got the Vayne counterpick R5 on the top side to try and beat the Gnar. I think this is also very smart. You left the Wukong flex open in case that was the direction you potentially wanted to go in. You know, if they wanted to, go for something that was a little bit more beatable by Wukong, then that would have been an okay choice. But you want to go for the aggressive counterpick. You pull out the Vayne in a do or die. Game number 3, and Aji was very relevant in this game, not only in side lanes, but he was very relevant in the final team fight as well, doing a lot of the damage they needed, especially around that final dragon. But you've got Betty and Woody, who are just very stable. On the bottom side of the map here, you've got the Jhin, you've got the Leona, plenty of options, but it's really the Akali that everything is running through, and that's why Maple is player of the series. Again, I think Akali could actually be really good in this meta. I don't really like B1 Syndra if the enemy has shown that they want to pick Akali. I think B1 Syndra is fine. That's, again, one of the big advantages of the champion is that, relatively speaking, she's not particularly counterable, in the same way that a lot of the other mid laners are right now. She's not, really weak in any phase of the game. She's just kind of good throughout and, does a lot of good things. It can function in a lot of different matchups. But Akali is one of the few champions that I do think actually can just punish Syndra, especially when Dinkato loses early, and we'll talk about that. But the laning phase did not go well for the Syndra, and at that point, it's just completely over. The Akali is going to scale infinitely into the late game, and the Syndra is never really going to be able to catch up in terms of gold. So credit to Maple. He needed to step up here today, and he absolutely did. But again, I want to give a lot of credit to Aji on the top side. I thought he was really good in the back half of the series, on the Gnar, obviously, in game 2, and on the Vayne here in game 3. I've never been the biggest Aji fan in the entire world. I think he's an okay player. I don't think he's like a superstar top laner, but I've always been a bit lower, I think, than consensus on him. I've always kind of felt like he was the odd man out on PSG, on this team full of really talented and very consistent players. I've never really felt like Aji is quite on the same level as like a Junjia or a Maple, or like what Woody and Betty have been doing recently, but he stepped up when they really needed him in this first series, and hopefully he can keep that form going. He was definitely better than Weiser, and I think he could be better than a player like Mirwin in the next matchup, which obviously we'll talk about a bit at the end of the video. Again, Betty and Woody, very consistent. Woody in particular, I actually thought had a really nice back half of this series, but PSG really relying on just being able to outplay their opposition, and lucky for them, they were able to do that in this series, and they got the win to move on. But for Pain on the other side, what the hell was that last fight? I mean, obviously, you can point to that dragon fight and say that everything went wrong. You can point to the fact that, you know, they lose a karaoke very early on in the fight, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, do they have smite? Are they going to be able to secure it? Well, I don't know. Titan's flashing out. Weiser is flashing in. Dinkato can't seem to find anybody with any of his abilities. Curry is just not doing anything. Like, genuinely, this might be one of the worst team fights I've ever seen in my entire life. I don't know what happened. I think it was Dom who said that CB LOL teams just lose their mind when they have to fight out of the pit, when they have to fight around objectives. And you know what? That seemed 100% accurate in this game, because Pain had an opportunity to get themselves back into it. PSG wasn't exactly playing perfectly. They actually had a lot of, you know, problems setting things up and getting the Vayne in and the Akali in consistently in some of these fights. Pain just basically gifted them everything that they could have wanted throughout this game. They were on soul point for so long, and they just could never actually capitalize. A lot of that can be placed on the shoulders of a couple of players. I'm going to give dead of the game to Dinkato in the mid lane, because again, him losing early was kind of the catalyst for everything to spiral out of control in terms of the gold lead for PSG. Akali is a very difficult champion to stop from ahead in the mid game. She just has so much prio, and she can do basically anything she wants as long as she has the gold to be able to pull off the play. And unfortunately for Dinkato, he got obliterated in the laning phase. Not only did he burn Flash early, but he died as well, and then all of a sudden, that laning phase is just gone. The Syndra is completely useless the rest of the game. I'm not going to take a victory lap just yet, because I still think Syndra could be valuable at this tournament, and I think better teams are going to make her look better, but I was really low on Syndra, at least in comparison to popular opinion. I think that there are mages that can be very valuable right now. I'm just not entirely sold that Syndra is one of them, and quite frankly, Syndra didn't exactly look great today. Like, Frescow, he played it twice and won on it twice, but, you know, game number one, he was kind of irrelevant. Game number two was definitely more centered around other pieces. It hasn't really felt like Syndra has impacted the game all that much, and then you get a couple of games of it here, and it's never really feeling all that good. Dinkato, like, just looked really bad. It looked very punishable in this game, so we'll see if that ends up playing out. I think it looks pretty good. My take right now that Syndra's just not the champion that I think everybody wants her to be. I think that there are other control mages that are just in better spots. Cough, cough, Orianna, so long as you're not just running it down. But I also think that both of these teams have bad meta reads, not just in the sense that, oh, they picked Rumble and Tristana and all that stuff that they talked about on broadcast, but they were banning out Aurora every game, and I think that that is a pretty horrendous meta read. I think Aurora's not strong at all right now. You want to let that thing through, because if the enemy team takes it, you're probably cheering. Like, that champ just can't really do all that much. Her numbers are just awful. So I don't really know. It was a very weird series in terms of my expectations. It felt like a lot of the big overreactions to the patch notes were in effect for the back half of this series with things like Syndra, but it also felt like teams didn't read some of the patch notes with things like Aurora, so I don't really know. It's just a very weird meta that I think is starting to develop. It's kind of the middle of, you know, what I've been pushing for and what I think a lot of the community has been pushing for, which is not really what I expected. I thought it would go one way or the other, but Dinkato has to be better. Again, losing lane, just a disaster. It's not like he was good in team fights, but Titan was miserable in some of these back half fights. Weiser, like, was horrible in some of these back fights on the Gnar. He was so fed. He was so strong on this Gnar, and all he needed to do was actually land an ultimate, and the guy, like, actively whiffs. I don't know if he, like, misclicked in some instances, but holy crap, this Gnar was horrible. Karaoke was really not good. Curry couldn't do anything. Overall, just not a great game for Pain, and unfortunately, it's those tiny mistakes that are going to cost you at the World Championship. This is the version of the team that had me placing them at the bottom of my rankings. They just are not clean. They are not, you know, suave with it, if you will. They just are not a good execution-oriented team. They need to be able to generate large leads and be able to wallet gap people in the late game, and that's just not going to happen very consistently at this tournament. So I'm happy that Pain won a game. I'm not sure they're going to win a ton more at this tournament. Unfortunately, I do not feel very good about them coming out of this series, and I feel worse about PSG than I did going into this series. I still think that there are things to like, but there is a lot of adaptation that I think this team needs to do. Mad Lions is going to be a gigantic test for them, but if they can overcome that, obviously they're now in the Swiss stage, and maybe just getting some confidence under their belt is exactly what they need. Alright, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2024 Play-Ins Day number 1 overview and analysis video. Our first two series are out of the way, done and dusted. We know the winners finals, I guess, of the upper side of the bracket here. Mad Lions taking on PSG Talon. The winner of that will qualify for the Swiss stage. The loser of that will move down into the lower bracket. That there's a lot of teams that they could potentially be facing. They play the winner of the losers match on the other side of the bracket, so still a lot to to play. We don't know who they will be facing just yet, but of course, Viking and Pain, they're not eliminated just yet. They go down to the lower bracket. They will play each other. The winner of that will take on the loser of the winner's game on the other side of this bracket. I know that feels like a very convoluted way to say it, but let's say 100 Thieves and GAM end up winning in round number 1 on the other side, and then 100 Thieves beat GAM. The winner of Viking and Pain would then play GAM for that final spot. And so there's still a lot left to play for. You're not out of the tournament just yet, certainly with the other side of the bracket being the weaker side of the bracket for sure. Viking and Pain definitely still have a lot to go off of, but Mad and PSG Talon, both of them are now only 1 series away from making it to Swiss stage. Who's going to make it? Well, I think PSG was the better team going into this tournament. Mad was certainly better on day number 1, and so, it's all going to be about whether or not, PSG can have a better adaptation, perhaps get more comfortable with the Worlds meta, or if Mad's going to be able to play through bot lane in the cohesive way that they were able to in their first series. It's going to be fun no matter what, but I would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, tomorrow we're going to be covering GAM versus the Hawks and also 100 Thieves taking on Movistar R7, so if you're interested in that, hit subscribe. We're going to be posting every single day for Worlds content, every single day that there is games at the very least, and so if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of this whole tournament and then off-season coverage once it's over, hit subscribe and hit that bell. And of course, if you did enjoy the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me, a lot more than you know, and it does help the channel out a lot, quite a lot as well, getting this video out to a lot of people, so I would really appreciate it. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.